I invite all the panelists to sit down here. I just like to take the opportunity to introduce a little bit. We heard here now very clearly that observations are needed on different scales, both when it comes to the spatial resolution and also the temporal. We have the local observations by indigenous people, and the timing, for instance, of sea ice and so on is critical to how the marine life is going to survive in that environment. That also put a lot of different challenges on funding for observations, and I think that even if there's no difference in importance of different scales, the small scales are a little bit easier to handle because they are normally coupled to one country, but when it comes to the more large scale, Pan-Arctic, it involves a lot of countries and thereby also is more challenging from a funding point of view. And that's why I think we have this panel here. So I would like to ask them to introduce themselves first, and then we can go in and discuss, also introduce your organization, and then we can go in and discuss some of these aspects. So please, can you start?
Okay, hello. You hear me? Yes? Okay, my name is Franz Simmler. I work for the European Commission in Brussels. I work for the DG RTD, Research and Innovation, and there in the Unit for Climate Change and Natural Hazards in the Environment Directorate. And I'm tasked with coordinating polar research within the Commission and also with international partners.
Okay.
I'm Erica Key. I am the NSF Arctic Observing Network Program Director. I'm also the U.S. lead for the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee task team, if you will, on Arctic observing, both within the U.S. and connections to international. I'm a member of the SEAON board as a U.S. representative, and I also am participating on the Conseil Scientifique for the French Strategic Arctic Plan.
I'm Canon Ellis Evans. I'm the head of the Arctic office at the Natural Environment Research Council, which is tasked with doing all the work, as it says on the tin, on natural environment there worldwide. We've got major commitments in the Arctic and the Antarctic in recent years. I'm acting primarily as the interface between the UK's somewhat fractured Arctic science community and the NERC administration there. So I have a rather strange role in the middle of this, but a very interesting one. And I'm also involved with the Svalbard Integrated Observing System, which is one of the EU-funded initiatives to develop Arctic infrastructure.
Hi, I'm not Daniel Labonte. I'm Donald McLennan. I'm the head of monitoring science at the just being born Canadian High Arctic Research Station. We have a strong mandate for monitoring, which I'll tell you about. And so I'll leave it for that for now.
I'm Commander Blake McBride. Previously I was the Arctic Affairs Officer for the Navy's Task Force Climate Change, and I ran the Navy's Arctic Roadmap. In a past life, I was the Executive Officer of the U.S. National Naval Ice Center. I live in Tokyo, Japan, and I live in Nishizabu in Roppongi area. And I am the Associate Director for Research for the Office of Naval Research Global, which is a subordinate command to Office of Naval Research Headquarters in D.C. I work very closely with Martin Jeffries and Scott Harper and many of the folks you know, and I know many of you from my previous job. I fund research, basic research, on meteorology, oceanography, and Arctic technology, Arctic science in general. I can fund travel, set up workshops, contribute funding like I did for this one, and would do research proposals. And we basically fund the non-US portion in the near term for ONR headquarters. That's our primary role.
Great.
Good morning. I'm Cheryl Rosa. I'm the Deputy Director with the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, and I'm also the Alaskan Director for the Commission, and my job involves pretty much trying to be on top of the research that's happening primarily in the Alaskan Arctic, but also circumpolar. I'll talk a little bit more later about our goals report for 2013-2014, but pull this together with the help of our DC office, and we basically tried to synthesize what's going on and what's needed in the Arctic, and we give our recommendations to Congress and the Office of the President.
Hello, my name is Jostein Sundet. I work at the Norwegian Research Council in the Polar and Climate Research Department, where we fund basic research and applied research in both poles and on climate. I'm also involved in funding infrastructures, both nationally and international collaboration, like the ESFRI in European, like the SIOS, ICOS, and other national interests. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. The title, as Jean-Claude said, for this panel is Agency Perspective on Arctic Observing, Coordination and International Collaboration. So I would like to challenge you with a question on if you have any vision on how international collaboration of funding could be managed in a way. I mean, we know, of course, that a single country will not fund another country's research, but that doesn't mean that you cannot coordinate the funding in one way or the other. So, do you have any vision on that? I think maybe we can start with you, Stein, if you can.
Thank you very much. When it comes to fund research, I think there is already a good ways of fund. We have some experience from the IPY that was, I say, was very successful in many ways. When it comes to observations and infrastructure, I think it's much harder. How to share, how to fund for a long time period to establish long time series. It might be that the exercise that is done in the European Union now with the ESFRI way of thinking, for instance, like ICOS, where different countries pay their own infrastructure, could be one way to think about this. But then, as a funding agency, we then need very clear advice from the researchers on what to measure, why to measure it, for what period, what will it cost, yeah, etc. So we need a body to tell us what to measure and why, and what's in it for society to learn about this.
Okay, thank you. Anyone who want to? Yeah.
I'll just mention this came up in our working group yesterday, just very briefly, but the Arctic Research Commission has been working on bilateral scientific cooperation with Russia, specifically in scientific access issues. And there's the sharing of the funding, then there's also the allowances that allows scientists to work together on long-term observing. And one of the things that I would recommend that we've been working on is looking at successful collaborations, things that have worked in the past, and 3 that come to mind. One Erica can talk about is this collaboration with France on this project that they're working on, but we've looked at specifically how NIH has shared money in Russia, and the APEX program, which has allowed scientific exchange more readily between nations that may not normally have done that, and it was one program that was cited as a good example, and that involves Germany, Russia, Korea, and some Middle Eastern countries. So not recreating the wheel and looking at what has worked in the past is a good first step.
I've been part of an initiative under the Circumpolar Biodiversity Monitoring Program that's under CAFA and the Arctic Council. And what has happened there for marine, freshwater, and terrestrial environments is international groups of scientists have gotten together and decided common monitoring parameters, indicators, methods. So you have a process where brainstorming at an international level around what are the key things to do, so you're sharing and optimizing that science expertise. And then you're coming up with a standardized set of indicators that you actually plan to measure and implement at the national level. So if we can be successful at implementing them nationally, then we do end up with a coordinated international monitoring approach that reflects international cooperation and optimizing international science.
Okay, Erika?
I know we're operating under a sequester and many of my colleagues couldn't be here, so please forgive my optimism. But I'm quite excited. We will be having a Belmont scoping workshop here, and that is one mechanism that can increase international collaboration without putting money in a common pot. There has been one scoping workshop before that was held in Canada during the IPY meeting in Montreal. And what came out of that was a clear prioritization for Arctic observing and also Arctic sustainability science, and the two are not unrelated. So we move forward at this workshop with funding partners both here and those who could not attend due to travel restrictions, and try to map that out. But what that means is any proposal that would come into a Belmont call would require 3 nations to participate on each and every proposal. If that isn't a good shove in an international direction, I don't know what is, but it also allows people to participate at different levels. In-kind support is just as welcome as new money, so that doesn't mean that you have to go find new sources to participate in something like this. It is international, it is multinational, and it is open to a variety of funding types. So while we talk about national agencies, I think industry is a very key and undervalued player, as are indigenous groups and permanent participants. So we hope to be as inclusive as possible in this process. National annexes will allow countries, agencies, organizations to spell out what their interests are. And what I really appreciate about that is it allows a number of perspectives to come to the table. We don't all need to meet at one common center. We can fund what we're comfortable funding, and we're not forced into sometimes uncomfortable territory. The other great part about Belmont is the Belmont Challenge requires interdisciplinary science, and by that they mean at the natural-social intersection. So I really encourage that within observing so that we can move more towards this system understanding and the real richness that can be achieved through the marriage of these data streams.
Okay, Kai?
Yeah, UK is a non-polar nation, but with a long tradition of polar research. Very highly organized in many ways in the Antarctic, which has allowed us to do a lot of long-term observational work, as well as the more immediate quick hit science. We've got experience of operating those sort of observing networks there at a national level and an international level. It's a completely different challenge for us coming up to the Arctic, where traditionally we've not been particularly organized. There's been individual cases of good work, but we're now trying to come into that. We're getting pressure from the science community saying these are the questions that we need to be addressing. But as was touched on by Mr. Inouye there earlier, the research councils in UK, as I think probably worldwide, are also getting pressure from the political side. So we've got a lot of things being put our way and trying to decide in the most appropriate ways to work. For us, it's clearly that we need to internationalize. As one of the founders of the Belmont Forum, we're very taken with that approach and wish to develop it. I think that's been explained very well by Erika. So we want to go along that path, but we're also interested in connections there in other ways there. So we're looking at bilateral and multilateral connections. And the EU model, as was mentioned earlier, particularly in relation to infrastructures, we think is something we would like to follow. But we are conscious of the fact that we're quite new into this particular game of funding. This is rather different to the way our research council has had to operate in the past. So as much as anything, this sort of meeting is a learning process for us.
Yeah, well, I'm sure it's a challenge for most of the funding agencies to have this. Okay, Franz?
Yeah, for us, for the European Commission, it's basically our core business to organize international collaboration. And we do that, of course, firstly among European countries, but also, and that's of increasing importance, with third countries on an international level, or on a global level. The EU framework programs are actually the old one, and FP7, which finishes this year, and the new one, Horizon 2020, which starts next year, are open to all countries all over the globe. So it's one of the most, or it's probably the most open research framework program worldwide. And to organize collaboration, we basically do this in two ways. One is by collaborative research projects, and we have a number of research projects in the Arctic. Like, for example, Ice2Sea, I think most of you are aware of, looks at the glaciers and ice sheets and their contribution to sea level rise. We have Page 21, which is a project looking at the thawing of the permafrost, and it's a project with very strong international collaboration with Russia, with US, with Canada, and other countries. There's the TOR project, which is related to observations of the thermohaline circulation in the North Atlantic and also in the Arctic regions, and there's a successor project called NACLIM, which does more or less the same thing, extending to the Arctic and sea ice issues. And again, we find there are very strong cooperation also with US regarding observations of the circulation in the oceans. Then there is the Access project that is coordinated by Jean-Claude. I'm not sure if you will tell us anything more about it, but it's very strong in looking at the impacts of change in the Arctic on different economic sectors, including fisheries, aquaculture, transportation, and so on. And it has a very strong stakeholder engagement, which is important for Arctic research in general. It has been mentioned a lot of times. And then the other pathway is infrastructure projects, like the one just mentioned, the SIOS project. And there's the Interact project, I think most of you know about, and we hear more about it by Terry Callahan later today. And I think it's a very nice showcase or a real showcase of how international observing networks can be, in a pan-Arctic way, can be set up and can be funded. Regarding international cooperation, we have several means of enhancing this. One is the Joint Science and Technology Committees, which we had earlier this year with US and Canada. And there was agreement that we should enhance our cooperation with respect to marine sciences and with respect to Arctic sciences. And based on these agreements, there's an initiative which will be launched later this month in a high-level event in Galway called the Arctic or the Marine and Arctic. The focus is more on marine, but Arctic is in there. Marine and Arctic Transatlantic Research Initiative. And within this initiative, we have set up two working groups, one on marine research and one on Arctic research, which is there to coordinate better our research efforts with US and Canada.
Okay, thank you. Anyone in the panel who want to add something?
Well, I think there was I was just going to say there's just one point that I'd forgotten to mention, which again Mr. Inouye there in his talk highlighted, was the fact that from a funding agency perspective, one is assaulted with a whole range of different ways of observing. All these different systems are out there, and that's a major challenge there to establish where one's going to make commitments, because anything in a longer term there is a serious undertaking for a funding agency these days.
Start with Blake.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was going to answer by taking a step back and then drawing down from the strategic level down to give a perspective. Let's take the Arctic Search and Rescue Agreement that the Arctic Council came up with. So I've spoke with Julie Gurley quite a bit about this when I was in D.C. in my last job, and I said, how are you going to implement this? Diplomats come up with agreements, whatever. How are you going to do it? I was like, well, you know, we're going to figure it out, or that's your job. So we tell the admirals and generals from our military and other security forces, Coast Guard, and they're like, yeah, I got nothing. I don't know anything about this. You do. So we have to have requirements. And the leaders can't articulate a requirement if they don't understand it. So it just goes nowhere. It goes in circles. It gives direction. We take direction from leadership. That's why we need requirements. But they need information from experts. That's why the Arctic Roadmap and Task Force Climate Change. And we would take this as a guidance from above and say, I can do it because it says so right here. It's not specific, but it tells me to work with people, and it doesn't tell me what. It expects me to find out what. And then it's an iterative process, and that gives us authority to do that. So that it goes down to ONR, and they say, what are you gonna work on? You know, the leaders in the Arctic security, Arctic nations, Coast Guard, whoever's going to help up there, they don't understand it either. They get together and try to grope blindly towards things to work on together. But there's a lot of it they don't understand. So I spoke with Lawson Brigham and Martin quite a bit about this. Lawson and I got together and said, the leaders don't understand sometimes the nature of the information that's given to them. It's too nebulous, in his words. So one way to do that is through a summit like this, where you can articulate things like what my bosses in DC told me. Admiral Kunder, the head of ONR, and Frank Herr, his deputy for meteorology oceanography, which is, if you can show model deficiencies, quantify the impact of observations. Let's say you want to do something with observations in the Arctic. What's that going to do? What bang am I going to get for my buck? Or in Admiral Titley's words, because I was his deputy for quite some time, what does this give me? How much more does it give me than I don't already know? Let's say I throw this much money at it. It gives me that much more, it's not worth it. If you can quantify, it's going to give me this much more. And you can do that with basic research. Put sensors out there, study it, and then you take that information, you put it into another study with models. That way you can show these people, these leaders, this is this and this is that. Now you can understand it, because they expect us to inform them in similar ways. My focus in ONR Global nationally is New Zealand, and I was hanging out with them, talking to anything. Methane hydrate, we're funding research on methane hydrates around New Zealand. So the NZARI is the New Zealand Antarctic Research Institute, and they have 10 priorities. They're trying to develop them, and the leadership, the government's going to come up with these 10 priorities for research in Antarctica. And the folks asked me, well, they started getting nervous because there's a finite amount of money, and they're going to get told what the priorities are, and it's going to redistribute the money for research. And I said, well, how do you think they figure that out? And they're like, well, that's why, I don't know. And I said, well, you have to help them. That's what we did in the Navy. We work with science. If you look at the roadmap, I don't know, go find all the scientists and ask them, and then figure out how they all work together. And then you can have an informed opinion about it. And if you can translate that to the NZARI people, Kiwis, then they'll have a better idea what could be the priorities. And maybe that'll influence and inform a stronger ability to make a decision on what should be funded for research. And then they can collaborate with other nations in cost sharing and all these other components to that.
Thank you. It's, of course, you have to have the science basis for whatever research and sort of, but the challenge here is how we should internationally try to coordinate it, and that is another challenge, I think. Donald, please, you want?
Yeah, I didn't emphasize the role that CHARS is directed to play internationally. We're going to be a place for science in the Canadian North. We've been liaising and meeting with many countries about trying to coordinate science over the very large land base of northern Canada. Martin Fortier is going to provide a few slides on CHARS, but I will just bring you up to speed a little bit. The building was finally, and the funds were finally announced last year. It's $142 million for the building to be built by 2017, $46 million up to 2017 for our science and technology program. And a portion of that is definitely dedicated to establishing a long-term monitoring network called CampNet, which may not be called CampNet, but that's what I'm using right now. And there's a white paper that describes sort of a vision that's meant to introduce a discussion about the best way to implement that. So there's certainly the idea as far as observing goes of going forward, and we certainly invite international participation in this observing network and the research that goes with it. We're not talking strictly about observing, we're talking about observing, analyzing, assessing, predicting, and reporting. I like to use those verbs for monitoring. So I'd like everyone to know that CHARS is going to be a place with a strong international focus. We welcome international scientists when we open our doors. We provide logistics and access to the north, working with Polar Continental Shelf Program. We're very keen to link to international programs around permafrost monitoring or meteorology or carbon flux or whatever. There are many outstanding international initiatives in all of those areas, and we're very keen to cooperate. So I think just by the fact of us actually being there and being a place for science, the countries that don't have Arctic land are particularly interested in this, and of course we invite anyone to approach us and look for opportunities to work with CHARS and contribute to doing science in the Arctic, in Canadian Arctic. Thanks.
Ulrika?
I realize that we've focused a lot on international, but coordination was one of the key words in this panel. I wear a lot of hats on a lot of different levels, but the coordination is pretty much the same. And whether it's at local or state, regional, national, international, it's equally important to me because they're all key partners in this enterprise. And I have a vast library on my computer and in my office of documents related to observing that range from the Nushagak-Mulchatna Watershed Council's, sampling plan to the Shell Vision Statement, which includes Arctic science, to the Finland Arctic Strategy. And with so much information, so many priorities already articulated, I think it's really key to look at these documents and look at the intersections, whether it's a local to international intersection or just across the board. I tried to do the same analysis with the white papers before I got here, but the results were so voluminous they filled up all of the memory on my computer, so I'll have to keep that up when I get back home. The key factor in this is finding those partners. And it's not just because there are 4 nations or 4 organizations that identified, say, fisheries management as a priority. It's about the context. It's about the perspective. As Director Inouye showed us this morning, he may be interested in marine shipping, but marine shipping from what perspective? And then how can we bring different groups with similar perspectives together to work? And part of the lack of that momentum forward is a communication piece that has long been missing. We have to rely on meetings such as this, which soon will only happen biannually, or we have to relate one-on-one, bumping into someone at a meeting or having an email relationship with them. You tend to lean on your neighbors and friends, and priority setting also shows that. We are very wont to prioritize anything. If you look at most of the priorities, they're climate change, global carbon cycle. These are centennial goals, not something that we're going to achieve in a 5-year plan. So we need to rely on a new communications strategy, and we're trying to build one in the US and offer it internationally. We're trying to build up something called the Arctic Hub, which is not going to replicate the many, many websites that are currently available. It's going to really circulate around communication. how do we use all of this information, all of this expertise that's currently available in document form or otherwise? How do we make something of that? How do we find those connections? How do we move those things forward that we've been talking about for quite some time? So we're trying to build a mechanism to do that. And hopefully that will do things like bring the community-based monitoring groups together or local traditional knowledge groups together that are otherwise, just by their very nature, isolated. So it's coordination through communication. It's coordination through doing what we like to do best, analyze things. Take the data, in this case, data is in the form of strategic plans, vision statements, what have you. Look at what's already out there and then try to buddy people up, make things happen, and move us down this road a bit further. And let's not forget our neighbors to the south, because they're facing the same challenges we are. We might be able to learn from them and stand on the shoulders of giants a bit to get ourselves further along.
Yeah, one point we need to mention is here there are already a number of international programs out there for observations. There's, for example, GEO, the Group for Earth Observation, which the European Commission is a member of and that we do support. There is the programs put in place by the WMO. There's Copernicus. So there's a lot of international programs out there that aim for observing, and most of them include the Arctic in one way or another. And these programs usually, they don't come with funding, but connecting to these programs, to their implementation plans that they've put in place might very well leverage funding for your observation strategy.
Okay. If there's no more input directly from the panel here, I open the floor if there's any questions or inputs from the audience. Okay, Paul?
It's an observation that this sustaining Arctic observing network has the concept of sustaining in it. And it seems to me that as a framework, this observational network is a fundamental element of any infrastructure that would be implied in the Arctic. And the overall element of that infrastructure relates to sustainability, sustainable development. And it was mentioned in terms of how this would be used. It's to facilitate good decision-making on issues that relate to environmental protection, economic prosperity, social equity. But as a justification for this program, in the absence of clearly identifying what that justification is up front, the funding, the persistence, the longevity of this program doesn't seem like it will mature effectively. And the interface is related to sustainability. And I think it's important in terms of this discussion to recognize sustaining Arctic observing networks and sustainable development are effectively one and the same, and that observing networks are a fundamental element of any infrastructure that will be implemented in the Arctic.
Okay.
This is one of the topics that Admiral Klunder and Dr. Herr, the Code 32 head of the METOC part of ONR, talked to me about, because it's one thing to fund basic research and come up with innovation or whatever and just walk away, or take what's next after that and then walk away from that and then keep moving that way. What happens is there is some sense of urgency or tension about how are you going to collect this data. It's kind of like the Australians and their network north of Australia. The buoys are starting to decay, and they're going to lose those observations they've taken for granted for a few decades. So Dr. Herr told me that one of the objectives of, say, using marine mammal tags, in this case, our talk, we do research to study them and fund it, develop the tags, and now we want to, in the U.S. sector, fund. So if any AOS people up there, please come talk to me. I need to discuss this. Do research to have those guys go out there, the animals tagged, and then study it, and then take the data and then show the value. We understand by contrast. So this justifies it. What's the point of all that? Well, a lot of that can't happen without international collaboration. And you can justify it by saying the Arctic Observing Summit says you need to do this sort of thing. And then we can point to it with academic rigor and go, see, I'm doing what they said. So that helps. And then the objective is that we take this to some long-term funding agency, not for research per se, but for sustaining these observation platforms, whatever they are, buoys or gliders. We have a lot of gliders all over the ocean that just collect data in the ocean. And we're going to keep doing that because we recognize the value in the models of this kind of data always being there. So it's a long-term funding of that data. So if we understand the Arctic in a similar way, then we can justify funding, not in ONR, but translating, this is Dr. Herr's point, you translate it out of ONR to a longer-term, more operationally minded funding agency for these observation platforms. This is how you translate from ONR to somebody else. And you can't justify that very well unless you frame it right. And then you can't really frame it right sometimes without the right kind of international collaboration to show that clearly. Through the right kind of studies and smart people getting together to show how you can see that and then show that to others. So this is one of my goals of being here in the first place.
Okay, that's great. Erika first. Yeah.
So I know there aren't any NASA people here, at least there's not a NASA program director here, but I used to do research for NASA, and I really appreciated their approach to developing satellites and decommissioning satellites, because it's something I have to deal with quite a bit when I've had a flat budget for several years, regardless of what program I'm funding. So when you talk about sustainability of an observing system, it becomes a challenge when your government or whatever is the controlling power over your budget is not supporting the growth of that. Because the tendency as time goes on is, let's grow our network, let's get bigger and bigger and bigger, and the budget's just not there to support it. So it forces a program manager into a situation where you have to prioritize things that others don't want to prioritize. And that means you're pitting something equally good against something else equally good. So what is the priority? Is it permafrost or is it physical oceanography? Is it glaciology or is it ecosystems? And it's very apples and oranges, but it's something that has to be done when you have a limited amount of resources. The NASA approach is let's do everything we can before we launch the satellite. Let's come up with our metadata, let's come up with our climate variable suite. Let's have everything on paper before that thing gets out of our hands where we can't play with it. And then once it's up there, it has a design lifetime. We often exceed the design lifetime of the satellites, and then it becomes a question of money. What can stay up? They put out a vote to the community of the satellites that should be decommissioned, and they let the science community vote on what stays up. And the science community can say, I value tropical rainfall over the geoid or over atmospheric limb chemistry. It's putting that power back into the hands of science to say what is going to be maintained. It's a process that we have to undertake every year. And I've heard a number of data sets be flagged as very important during this discussion. When a proposal comes in, we really need to see an indication of why it's very important. What is the metric that determines that importance? And also, what is the evaluation that's been done to the network to determine which of the sites that are being measured are still of that high level of importance? So I think of the Lorax and I think of biggering and biggering and biggering. Sometimes we need to thin a bit and determine if we want to keep it going and we only have this much, what do we really need to keep? What is the most important thing? And I hear that from certain communities, but not from all. And it would be a conversation and an input I'd appreciate receiving.
Yeah, well, I really wish we had the opportunity to have this discussion within the Arctic community, and that we had the resources of the satellite missions to build the infrastructure for Arctic research, and then we could prioritize which data we would like to work with. But I think we are very far away from that. Okay, I think Donald was first.
The sustaining part of this is near and dear to me, having established a monitoring program at Parks Canada for our national parks. Focusing on the sustaining part of that is critical. I've made the statement many times that if you can't guarantee the sustaining of your network, you probably shouldn't be establishing it in the first place. You should do as much work as you can up front on the sustaining side of it. And the key element, as far as I'm concerned, for sustaining is to provide useful information at a scale and a time that is timely for people who ultimately fund the program and make decisions about funding. So at this point, for example, CHARS has a mandate in this funding cycle, this 5-year funding cycle for monitoring, but when the next funding cycle comes along and distributing how money is going to be spent, that money will be spent based on the usefulness of the information that's coming out of the program. So questions like what is happening to country food for communities in the short and long term? What is happening with community infrastructure and how does it affect engineering? What is happening at a territorial scale? What kind of questions does a territorial government have in this changing world that northern communities are facing at different scales? And there are even critically important global questions around, for example, carbon budget in the terrestrial Canadian Arctic, or the marine for that matter. I know more about the terrestrial. What is happening with carbon in terms of being a source or a sink at the scale of the Canadian Arctic, as it may affect global climate change and carbon loading in the atmosphere. So the critical thing for sustaining is to develop useful information where people will see the value of the system, it will feed back through, and it will be and then become sustaining. Other things that are critical are that it needs to be cost effective. You need to measure the monitoring program needs to be as simple as possible, but no simpler. That's a quote, I think. And we really take that to heart, that a monitoring program needs to be elegant. It needs to answer some specific questions, but it also needs to be general to deal with surprise. It needs to, and so it needs to be cost effective. It needs to be useful. And it needs to optimize the resources that are put into it, both human and financial. And finally, it needs to serve the needs of those who contribute to it. So if we're talking about this Canadian Arctic Monitoring Predicting Network, then we're hoping for partners from across governments, across academia, from communities. So those contributors need to know that when they put something into this program, they're actually getting something back out of it that matches that contribution. So those are really the key things. The fact is it needs to provide useful information, it needs to be cost effective, and it needs to have value to those who contribute to it.
Well, it's great that Canada is putting that effort into studying the carbon balance of the terrestrial, but this is, I think, a typical example where we really need to have a pan-Arctic study, both on the terrestrial and the marine side, because carbon is moving around the whole globe. So I hope that will be a topic for next AOS, where we can involve more of the other side of the Arctic too.
Well, of course, we're extremely keen to involve the circumpolar community in that, absolutely.
Okay, Frans.
I think an observing system is more likely to be sustained if it's an integral part of an operational service. There are many operational services we could think of for which Arctic observations are essential, like, for example, iceberg and sea ice now and forecasts, seasonal climate prediction, long-term climate prediction, global climate predictions actually. So there are many important services that we need, for which we need Arctic observing systems. And as much as your observing system is integral part for such an operational service, it's likely to be sustained.
Okay. Any more input from? Okay, please.
Hello, my name is Mikko Strandov. I'm representing Finland here, but actually I'm a delegate from Finland to the GMES committee, so the new name being Copernicus. So I would actually, in a way, want to ask, because in Europe, I think the idea of when you have research develop new, let's say, observations, that at some point you have to, because of the sustainability of this action, to change the funding scheme and go into something else than to try to do it with another project of research. And Copernicus program, which now will start next year, is the tool for this in Europe. And that means that you can keep the research at a pretty much flat kind of resourcing, because that can shift away from those actions that now are being seen as needing an operational phase away, and then you have, let's say, money available again for something new and something different. And let's say, maybe the Canadian thing is something in this direction, but do the other participants, do you have anything similar happening? Copernicus is a little bit more space, let's say, oriented than just general, but it actually does have also an in situ component. So some of even Arctic observations could also from there get this kind of operational phase money to take it away from the research budgets and put it more in another funding scheme.
That's kind of what I was talking about before, was the part of the reason why ONR leadership is talking to me in the way that I referred to earlier is that we're aware of the fact that you develop a sensor, you fund the research to develop a sensor, and it collects data in say the Arctic. And then, correct me if I'm wrong, but often these things are out there in the research area. They're not operationalized by long-term funding agencies, like NOAA or somebody that just pays for satellites to collect data. It's another story that their satellites getting old and arguing to have more satellites like that. But these sensors are out there, and then the more they live to support new research that uses the data that causes them to exist. But they'll die on the vine if there's no more funding cycles and proposals in there trying to keep them alive so that you can do the studies that are supported by the other. So the idea is that you take it out of that realm, and you, through the proper kind of internationally funded study, which is kind of what I'm hoping to instigate in some ways, so that we can contribute to funding part of it and get the U.S. portion involved in it. It's much more convincing if there's other countries that think this is are arguing for this kind of effort. If you can show that, then you can show the operational funders, not the research funders, that you should have this and you should sustain it. Because if you don't, then we have the research to show the kind of hit you're going to take on doing your job. A lot of times the people that predict the weather, their job is to predict the weather accurately. And if you can show the decrease in accuracy, therefore they can't do their job as accurately, that's telling them they can't do their job anymore, and they get nervous about that, and they reprioritize the funding for that kind of sensor or observation and make it higher. Otherwise, it becomes a victim of the, I don't really know what the value of that would be if we just make it, if it just went away eventually. Therefore, nobody's telling me, so it must be low. And I can make a budget cut because I have to make budget cuts, and that's vulnerable, and they'll just cut it eventually. And then you can't quantify the loss very easily.
Okay, Marika.
We're just now starting a conversation with the NSF AON community about the program and about how it's structured and the goals of the program. And we hope to better define these in the coming year or so. To address one of many questions is this sustainability question. I like to think of AON as an experimental program where you're welcome to fail. We want to learn how to do this better. We want to understand the engineering, the communication, the deployment, the optimization modeling, the data dissemination better. But in order to support both those long-term monitoring systems that have proven their utility and have done what we asked them to. They've looked left and right. They've partnered internationally. They are well connected. They have protocols and metadata standards, and they're functioning well. Do they graduate from Aon? And then where do they go? Because obviously we have some funding issues with our operational partners, that they are not able to absorb these things, and also because they have priorities of their own and have to support in-house science. So we're beginning a discussion within NSF, and we hope to continue this at the Aon PI meeting that Craig Lee will be putting together within the coming year, to talk about that particular issue and whether or not we need to beg our case with Congress for a new line of funding. If that's something like a major research center, or to reclassify the graduated programs to allow new systems to come in. We still have many gaps that are not funded by the NSF Aon program that we would like to encourage to come in, but we need to make room. We need to share, and we need to create a space that allows for the long-term monitoring that was one of the original goals of the program. So I just wanted to put that out to that community, that we would like your input, and please send us emails. Thank you.
Okay, we have a question down here first.
Am I loud enough? Okay. The discussion, my name is Jim McFarland. I'm with International Submarine Engineering. It sort of sounded like the Arctic was a continuum. It's not really a continuum for people to join forces and go and do things, because it's defined by the boundaries are defined by Article 76 of the Law of the Sea, and that will define who has to work where. Thank you.
Yeah, that's just really what we're talking about. How should we collaborate international and try to, from a scientific point of view and observational point of view, avoid to have these boundaries within the different countries?
If it doesn't work totally in the south of the border, how's it going to work on the northern side?
Well, that's what we have to work with. Okay, Peter, you had a question here. Come here.
I was wondering what the opinion of the panel is on the question of, are we ready for a truly internationally funded international Arctic observing system? I understand there are certain attempts that are being made, and I think they are really positive, they are great. But do you think we are ready, or how long will it take, or is it possible in general to come to a mode where this system would be truly internationally funded, and either through agreements, who is putting what into what, or by going further and using some of the EU models that have been referred to before, to a point where certain countries, or the countries who are interested in the system, are putting a certain amount of resources into a joint pot against which international groups could apply for funding?
Okay, that's a good challenge. Who wants to start? Okay, Franz?
I really think that some of the projects we have in place already really go very far in that direction. We are an international organization funding international infrastructures like SIOS, and these programs are open to participants from other countries, and the Interact infrastructure is a nice example how this could work. It still needs input from different countries like Russia to support their own infrastructure in some way. What we can do is to connect them all together and to allow researchers to access all these infrastructures. And in Interact, we will hear more later. There has been kind of an international funding mechanism as well, for money put in from different sources to be available for all stations. I think this would be a model to how it could work. And the other one would be the Belmont Forum that Erica has talked about earlier.
I think that was the point I was making earlier, that certainly from a UK point of view, we see a whole series of different ways. There doesn't seem to be any one way that at the moment that we should proceed, but there are a number of different ways, and we want to follow them. As a nation of our scale, there we're always going to be a contributor to, rather than leading a major Arctic observing network. But we certainly take the view that for the different situations, there are a number of options that we could potentially go, and we need to be more flexible in the way we think about our funding to deal with that. The Belmont Forum is offering some things. Joint Programming Initiative is also coming along with ideas. They've all got merits and demerits. So it's at the present time, I don't see that there's one system that we say, right, we would buy into, and that would then give us a sustainable observing system for the future. We will contribute where we can to try and move the whole thing along.
I would just add that data sharing and data access has to be part of this. We're hearing a lot about funding, sharing of international funding, but we can't ignore the fact that data access, data sharing among international groups is definitely, between some countries it's fine, between others it's a hard nut to crack. So it's something that has to be considered when we're trying to develop these programs.
I think something that Director Inouye brought up before is a key factor in this, rather than focusing on the common pot, focusing on the common knowledge of what individual nations are considering, what is coming down the pike. So it's an awareness, it's a communication. SAON is one mechanism for that, where we can have an integration of information. We currently only meet twice a year. If we can have more of those conversations, I mean, we're aware of some things that are being generated within the community, and we can, you know, with that advanced knowledge, we can talk to one another and work together. But more often than not, I can recall a personal case where I was on a French ship, and we were directly following a German ship, which was directly following a Spanish ship, and we were all maintaining the same line in the Southern Ocean. And just a little more communication might have all gotten us on the same ship, saved a lot of resources, and we would all be able to get the information that we needed. So I know probably everyone up here has a really busy day job, but we have to make ourselves a little bit busier by becoming aware of what our neighbors are doing. And I think that awareness will facilitate some of those issues that currently hamper the international co-funding of networks.
I think one of the keys here is hearkening back to what I was speaking about before, and that is, why should we cooperate internationally? What are the benefits of cooperating internationally? And making it super clear from a communication perspective that what happens in the Arctic affects the entire globe. International shipping will be traveling through the Arctic, involves all countries. Migratory species cross international borders. So in order to deal with these truly international global issues, we need an international global solution to it. So make those kind of arguments to funders and showing the benefits of this cooperation.
To follow up on what Erica said, as an example, I'm working with the Kiwi Navy. They're testing ice-phobic coatings on their ship when they're taking offshore patrol vessels down to the ice in Antarctica. And so we're interested in working with it because it's a vessel of opportunity, and it's an ally, and we can work with them. And this sort of collaboration is woe unto those who do not take advantage of such opportunities, because then they'll waste their resources and time. So I'm looking down at Antarctica opportunities so that I can leverage that kind of knowledge and experience to the Arctic and vice versa. So as Erica said, there's ways of working together that you can argue very, very effectively through an international lens that you're doing it smart, you're working smarter, not harder, and you're saving money. And the leadership, the people with the checkbook will go, oh yeah, that's encouraging. I'm saving money by doing this, not spending money, and you can egg them on a little bit that way.
Well, as scientists, we really try to take advantage of these opportunities to collaborate and so on, but we have also quite a few experiences when it's not so easy to do it because of different funding cycles, communication between funding agencies and so on, and I think this kind of dialogue is really what we like to have in order to smoothen out all these difficulties. And so I'd like just to finish this panel discussion with a question to you. If this kind of summits and this kind of discussions we have had today, is that a good way to try to smoothen the collaboration, international and so on? Is that a way to go forward, or do you have your other means to do that, or how should we progress in order to make it easier, both for easier and more cost efficient? Do you have any?
Well, as I say, I think that this is an absolutely necessary step that we have these observing summits. I think there's a very good idea that's been generated here. It's throwing up loads of ideas in the various meetings there, and these can be worked on there in this structure, which otherwise they tend to be raised and then just get lost, or they're only within a small group. Here we're talking about a very, very large grouping people. I think what's important is the structure of this group, that you have the right sort of representation here to have these discussions. And I think that'll be the important thing with an observing summit in future, is that it is properly balanced and it's got the right representation to ensure that the lessons are brought out and taken back.
So then I hope that you within your funding organizations bring that message back and take the right people to the next summit too. Okay. Yeah.
In my last job, we worked very closely with Norway and Canada and other Arctic security forces to set up two things: the Arctic Security Forces Roundtable and the Arctic CHOD meeting, Chief of Defense, the head of the militaries in all these security forces in all these countries. And these kinds of things, and many of them told us that the things like the U.S. Navy did with the roadmap, it enables you to, A, think it through because you've got something to do, a data point, or an activity, where you can consolidate expertise and focus your energy, think it through, and then the report is really useful if done right. You can reference that report. One of the ways that he was the first secretary of the Russian embassy in Oslo, and through these activities, he told us, because there were a lot of sensitivities to these discussions, and he said, confidence building, the presence or lack thereof of Russia in certain ways was mentioned several times yesterday. Confidence building maneuvers, the reports illustrating things in a very straightforward and understandable way, and then you do this over time. Next year we'll have another one. That way these things can be shown to other countries, and they can see a pattern, they can see things that aren't threatening to them, they can see the value and merit of this kind of international collaboration, and it's, the sort of value of doing it is a little bit, you're edging towards showing it more clearly and convincingly.
Okay. Erika, please.
So I'm very excited where SEAN is heading. I'm invigorated by what's happened in the past year, and I have very high hopes that SEAN will become this integrator and this perspective, high-level perspective on Arctic observing. So I think that's one strong positive in this summit, is the first step in that process. But I think what I really enjoy, and I feel very honored to have been able to make this trip, is the interpersonal interaction with fellow funding officers and with heads of organizations. I'm very glad to meet Vera for the first time, and Director Inouye, and to learn their perspective. It's something I'm not going to get from a website or from a strategic plan, to understand where they're coming from. The strategic plan may say, I'm interested in sea ice extent, but when you actually hear their presentation or get a moment to talk to them during a coffee, then you understand we're interested in sea ice for this purpose. From this perspective, this is our history, this is our community. And so when you're developing a call or a partnership, you know who you can call on, you've made that first interaction with them, and you can say, we're understanding and appreciative of your viewpoint, and we're not coming at you just, for your dollars or yen or whatever you're putting on the table. We actually appreciate what you're bringing to the table, and we think it'll make for a richer observing activity. And so I really appreciate this summit opportunity for that purpose.
Okay, thank you. That was a very nice final word. I think that before we go and break for 50 minutes coffee, we should give the panel a great applause.